Hello, I'm grateful to the Toronto City Opera for the opportunity to talk about Susanna. This is a work that I've been really interested in for a while, but is only rarely performed outside the United States. In the past 10 years, there have been 12 American productions. The only American operas with more are Porgy and Bess and Amal and the Night Visitors, but only one production in Canada, one in the UK, one in South Korea, and none in continental Europe. The first part of my talk today is about the 19th and 20th century phenomenon of national opera and how Susanna fits into the history of the development of a distinctly American style. And after situating Susanna in this context, the second part of this talk will zoom in on the opera itself, its music, its story, and its thoughtful and timely representation of bigotry and sexual violence. Modern opera has a fraught relationship with national identity. As the world became more divided into distinct nations, the desire for distinct national artistic styles caused great anxiety for artists, critics, and scholars, which we're still to some degree in the midst of today. I expect many of you have heard critics and composers ask questions like, what is Canadian opera? Or try to identify examples of great Canadian operas. Prior to the 19th century, Italian and French opera had been hegemonic. Even composers from outside of Italy and France, like Mozart, were nonetheless writing in distinctly Italian and French styles. However, the rise of nationalism amid 19th century European revolutions spurred a desire for music and art to speak to a national sensibility. At the same time, German opera suddenly became a major force under Wagner in a way it had never been before. The German style became so prominent that the other nations were left scrambling to conceive of their own national operatic styles and define themselves for the modern world in contrast to Wagner. As just one example, in Bohemia, what we now know as the Czech Republic, there was a similar scramble to define Czech opera. Dvorak is the primary figure here. He and his contemporaries looked back to slightly older composers, especially Smetana, with new reverence. Many of the works written in these new national schools continue to be performed regularly in their countries of origin, but only a few have achieved much popularity away from home. Dvorak's Rusalka is one good example. If you're interested in learning more about Dvorak's operas, John Holland has a brand new book on the topic. Regular TCO patrons may recognize John as Leporello from last year's production of Don Giovanni. And as founder of the Canadian Institute for Czech Music, John is also creating more opportunities to see Czech opera right here in Toronto this year. Smetana's The Bartered Bride is coming up on March 6th. But back to the 19th century. Even Italy, the birthplace of opera, was not immune to this new nationalistic anxiety about operatic style. There was immense pressure on young composers to define themselves in opposition to Wagner, and at the same time an obsession with naming Verdi's heir. Puccini's early operas, including La Bohème, achieved lukewarm reviews from critics who were unsure whether he was too modern, not modern enough, or modern in the wrong way. This anxiety around musical nationalism is especially prominent in the United States in the 20th century, as a young nation eager to establish itself as culturally distinct from its European heritage. But at the same time, American artists in this period tended to travel to Europe to study with the masters there. And so there's this constant tension in American music between the desire to be seen as legitimate by the inherited standards of European art, but also as a distinct and unique artistic culture unto itself. Consider as one example Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring. In the 1930s and 40s, Copland was developing a vernacular American style intended to reflect the ideas of American democracy. In practical terms, the idea here is that art should be accessible to the public and reflect their experience. With no inheritance of American classical music to build on, Copland looked instead to contemporary popular music and jazz to develop his vernacular style, inspired by the wide open spaces of the American landscape. This excerpt from the interlude includes a quotation of the Shaker song Simple Gifts, which Copland develops throughout his orchestration. The interpolation of folk music is a commonality across many national classical music styles, as we just heard here in the American style through Copeland. Copeland looked to folk music and other popular styles that would be recognizable to his audiences and ground his musical aesthetic in the sound of a particular location and people. While American classical music was finding a unique voice, American opera was still fledgling. Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, which he described as a folk opera, premiered in 1935. It draws on vernacular American music, especially jazz, to tell a story about the lives of its African American characters in the Jim Crow South. While Porgy and Bess is now considered a landmark American opera and is the most performed American opera in the US, it wasn't taken very seriously at the time of its premiere on Broadway. It wasn't really until it was revived by the Houston Grand Opera in the 1970s that critics began considering it a real opera at all. Menotti's operas from mid-century were well received and quite popular, and some continue to be performed today. Here's an excerpt of an ensemble from The Consul to give you a sense of his musical aesthetic. Reception of Menotti's works during his career and today tends to focus on their debt to European composers, including Puccini, Strauss, and Mussorgsky, and so he's often excluded from conversations about American opera for not being American enough, allegedly. So this is the landscape into which Carlisle Floyd enters with Susanna in 1955. Floyd was born in 1926 and raised in South Carolina. His father was a Methodist minister, and his mother taught him to play the piano. He pursued further studies in piano performance at a local college. And his teacher there, Ernst Bacon, instilled in Floyd the importance of forging a distinctly American aesthetic in classical music, reflecting the country's history, literature, poetry, and folklore. Floyd began composing while teaching on the piano faculty at Florida State University in the 1940s and 50s, with this goal of creating a distinctly American aesthetic very explicitly in mind. He composed a couple of operas for the music faculty at FSU, and then in 1955, his third opera was Susanna. Floyd wrote both the libretto and the music for Susanna and his other operas, modeling himself perhaps a little after Wagner. Like Wagner, he also called these early works musical dramas, preferring that nomenclature to the stuffy, out-of-touch connotation that opera already had. Susanna premiered at FSU in 1955 and was picked up by the New York City Opera the following year. That City Opera premiere was a critical success and won Floyd international recognition overnight. Critics called out specific elements of the work that they admired, typically focusing on a perceived sense of authenticity, an unself-consciousness and commitment to the words and the drama. The immediate critical response also makes it clear that a big part of Susanna's success was due to Floyd's perceived success as an American composer writing a great American opera in a homespun style. So with the rest of our time, let's now turn to the opera itself. Susanna is loosely based on the apocryphal story from the Book of Daniel. A group of men, elders in the community, spy on the beautiful Susanna while she's bathing. They are overcome with lust and they accost her, demanding that she have sex with them. When she refuses, they are furious. They claim that they saw her with a lover and have her arrested on these charges. The heroic Daniel intervenes and is able to prove that the men are lying, freeing Susanna and bringing dire consequences down on the elders. Floyd's adaptation moves the story forward in time to a religious rural community in the 1930s in Tennessee, very close to the world of his own childhood. Susanna Polk is a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. She and her brother Sam are outsiders in their small mountain community and treated with hostility by the elders. As in the source material, the elders come across Susanna bathing, but in the opera, she's unknowingly bathing in a creek they want to use for baptisms. They blame Susanna for the lust evoked by their spying and coerce Susanna's friend into saying that they'd had sex, although they hadn't. The elders present these concocted crimes to Reverend Blitch, the new preacher in town. At a revival meeting, Blitch tries to get Susanna to confess and ask for forgiveness, but she runs away. Blitch finds her alone at her home later that night and makes another effort to get her to repent and save her soul. When she doesn't cooperate, Blitch tells her how lonely his profession is and forces himself on her. After the rape, Blitch realizes that Susanna wasn't lying about being a virgin. He begs God and Susanna for their forgiveness and tries to convince his congregation that they're wrong about her, but they won't listen. Sam finds out what happened and kills Blitch, and the community attempts to drive Susanna and Sam out of the valley. Floyd's choice of source material was inspired in part by his experience in Florida in the 1950s, in the midst of the Second Red Scare. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings for suspected communists in Hollywood, which led to a blacklist of artists. Studios went on to boycott more than 300 artists, including Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles. Senator Joseph McCarthy used his time in office to exploit the American fear of communism. He rose to fame for claiming the government was infested with secret communists and homosexuals who needed to be flushed out. During his time as chairman of the Senate Committee on Government Operations, he had access to immense resources to conduct investigations of suspected communists in the government. Florida had its own counterpart to McCarthy in Governor Charlie Eugene Johns, who headed an investigation committee nicknamed the Johns Committee, starting the year after Susanna's premiere. Florida's universities were particularly in the crosshairs as nesting grounds for communists, homosexuals, and civil rights activists. While no charges or suspicions were brought against Floyd during this time, he had friends and colleagues at Florida State who were targeted, and one faculty member attempted suicide as a result of his persecution. In Susanna, Floyd found and embellished a story about unfounded accusations used as an excuse to persecute the innocent. Susanna also takes aim at religion as a vehicle for persecution. Floyd represents Southern Christianity, informed by revival meetings and his experiences with his father's Methodist community as a child. Susanna dramatizes the tyranny and hypocrisy of Southern Puritanism that claims to value compassion and forgiveness while persecuting anyone perceived as different. Floyd didn't have any formal training as an opera composer. He trained to be a concert pianist and had a great interest in literature and theater. Susanna is infused with music from Floyd's life in the American South, including faithful representations of square dances, folk ballads, and hymns. The Jaybird song that Susanna and her brother Sam sing is an old African-American rhyme Floyd remembered from his childhood, set to music in the style of a folk song. But unlike Porgy and Bess, Susanna wasn't dismissed by critics as merely a folk opera. The recognizable elements of popular American music are combined with moments of beautiful and sophisticated lyricism. This deft balancing act recalls Aaron Copland's accessible, easy-to-love style from earlier. Floyd's musical language, when he isn't quoting or mimicking folk tunes, feels effortless. He writes beautiful, memorable melodies that are accessible without being predictable. Susanna's first aria, Ain't It a Pretty Night, displays this elegant musical aesthetic. Despite Floyd's lack of formal operatic training and frequent exclusion from scholarly narratives about the development of an American operatic style, Susanna can be clearly placed in the context of the development of an American musical style at mid-century. His use of American popular music, woven into a cohesive, accessible musical language, deftly blends high and low culture to speak to a wide audience of opera lovers and neophytes. Finally, I'd like to spend some time digging into one particular element of Susanna's story that is particularly important to my scholarly work. My new book, Rape at the Opera, investigates the ethics of representing sexual violence on the operatic stage. In that project, I weigh the risks and benefits of portraying sexual violence explicitly in operatic productions against the risks and benefits of obscuring or reinterpreting it. If this sounds like something you might like to learn more about, I encourage you to look up Rape at the Opera. The apocryphal story of Susanna and the Elders is about the depravity of the men who blame this innocent woman for their lust. And yet this story became a popular theme for painters, and these paintings work together to inspire a somewhat different meaning. In general, these are paintings that depict Susanna as acquiescent to her voyeurs, or at the very least, not particularly bothered by their attention. They tend to focus on the sexual pleasure the elders take in looking at Susanna. And this choice of subject matter, represented in this way, feels like little more than an excuse to represent an exposed female body, with the plausible deniability of simply representing a biblical story. Art and film critics have theorized that Western art in general has a male gaze. That is, that artists have typically represented women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the viewer, who is assumed to be a heterosexual man. Women are passive objects to be observed. Men are the active agents who observe, and in most cases, who paint the paintings. In the case of these artworks of Susanna, the viewer shares the perspective of the voyeurs, gazing on this passive, beautiful object of desire. This is the trap of the story of Susanna and the Elders. The source material is a story about the evils and corruptibility of lust, but it has this representational history of fetishizing Susanna's body and perpetuating the very voyeurism that is villainized in the story. But there are ways to negotiate this trap. Consider this painting of Susanna by Artemisia Gentileschi. One of the rare women artists in this canon, Gentileschi is one of the first to represent Susanna's discomfort rather than the pleasure of the elders as central. The viewer here is not aligned with the voyeurs, but is in a position to empathize with Susanna's experience. So what about Floyd? According to the opera's stage directions, Susanna does not appear on stage during the scene where the elders see her bathing. The focus is on them watching her, looking somewhere off stage. In the Toronto City Opera production, the elders looked out toward the audience when they're gazing at Susanna. The audience is thus aligned with the innocent victim being leered at, and not with her voyeurs. The scene becomes clearly about their lust and their lechery without perpetuating those feelings in the audience. I feel that Floyd expertly avoided playing the part of one of the elders in his representation of Susanna in the bathing scene. However, Floyd takes another big risk by adding an element of physical violation to the story not present in the apocryphal tale of Susanna. Here, too, I find Floyd to be successful in crafting a powerful and still very timely story about sexual violence. Unlike a lot of operas that involve sexual violence and that I write about in my book, Susanna makes it very clear that this is a serious crime that has disastrous consequences for its victims. The story also highlights the insidiousness of sexual violence in our society. It's not a story about a single evil man who takes pleasure in the violence of rape. It's a story about how dangerous it can be when a culture's definitions of rape don't all line up. Let's watch a brief excerpt from the second act of Susanna. At this point, Blitch has gone to Susanna's home to try once more to get her to confess her sins. She pleads with him to believe that she hasn't done what she's been accused of, but he remains convinced that what the townspeople have told him is true. Blitch doesn't realize that what he's doing is rape. Part of this we see. Susanna is too physically exhausted and broken at this point to fight back anymore. She gives no indication of consent, but she also doesn't physically resist Blitch in most stagings. We would do well to remember, though, that she lives out in the woods and her brother isn't home. She likely knows that even if she were to fight and scream, it wouldn't do much good. But Blitch also wouldn't think that this is rape because he believes Susanna is no longer a virgin. She's a ruined woman in his eyes, an unwed woman who believes that who he believes has had sex with at least one man already, and who is flaunting her body to others intentionally. Historically, many laws about rape apply only in the case of virgins. This holds true in the Bible as well, where rape is essentially a property crime against a woman's father. Unmarried women who are not virgins are condemned to death by stoning in Deuteronomy, in a lot of cases, regardless of how they became no longer virgins. The morning after, Blitch begs God for forgiveness and says, "She was untouched before her young body was defiled by my hands." This regret comes from the realization that he was wrong about Susanna the night before. Somehow, he learns that she's a virgin during the night that he spends with her. From Blitch's point of view, his error wasn't in forcing a woman to have sex against her will. His error was one of categorization. He believed that Susanna was the kind of woman you're allowed to use for sex without her consent, but it turned out she was the other kind. We've covered a lot of ground in this talk. The bottom line is there are a lot of reasons to think this opera is interesting, and a lot of different ways that we might choose to engage with it, whether as a great American opera, or for its adept amalgamation of high and low culture, for its criticism of religious hypocrisy and persecution, or for its still incredibly relevant depiction of sexual violence and rape culture. Its music is approachable, accessible, and moving. It's a modern opera that most of its audiences will probably actually like, and its story continues to have a lot to say to us in a culture that is not so different from Floyd's Depression-era Tennessee. So I hope that you've enjoyed this rare Canadian performance.